for military aircraft, and he also states that everything you've seen on Star Trek they're already 20 years ahead of. Do you believe that?
I do, to be honest, yeah, definitely. I mean, certainly from the testimony of people like Colonel Phil Corso, who worked at the Pentagon's Research and Development Department from 61 to 63, he alleges that he was given technology from the crash UFO at Roswell from 1947, and he was to seed that technology into mainstream industry through government contracting programs. You know, he's one of several that have spoken out. They're highly credible military people. You know, I believe they are speaking the truth. They have used this technology and back-engineered it into our current technology.
Well, Ray, of course, you were at the famous Press Club conference in Washington, D.C., where a lot of these military people, but I think Pete Hellier was there as well, people that were in government, in military, airline pilots like yourself, and even astronauts, all coming together to give their view and disclosure of the fact that UFOs are real. Would you say, having met those people in Washington, spoken to them, that you now believe 100% we're dealing with something that may be out of this world?
Difficult to say. We were talking before the programme about a German research facility during the Second World War, which appeared to have a massive power source operating in a circular disc-shaped arena created of concrete, which, from all intents and purposes, would have possibly been used for levitating some sort of vehicle. And then that was 1944, when the Russians took that over. Sorry, 1944. So that's 64 years ago. What's happened since then, we don't know. If it's extraterrestrial, it's a real moot point at the moment. I don't know the answer to that. I think there's an awful lot from Earth that we don't know about, and I think possibly that by describing everything we see around us as being extraterrestrial because we don't understand it may be a misnomer.
Well, Alan, let's come back to you. 90% of these sightings, maybe even 95, have a rational, logical explanation, possibly connected with the military and black ops, as they would call them. But would you say you now have enough evidence to say that UFOs are real and are out of this world?
Well, definitely. I mean, as Ray said, there is no doubt there's going to be military technology. That is without a doubt. I mean, it is said that the stealth fighter was operating 10 years previous to anybody knowing about it in the general populace. So a black triangular object, you know, operating from the 60s onwards. But I think, you know, the more you look into this subject and speak to people, you know, they are seeing creatures involved with this, and the Roswell. There's 600 witnesses from the Roswell incident, you know, acknowledging that there were beings that were not human. So.
Well, Roswell, the story rolls on, and I'm sure we'll be talking about that when we debate in hour 3 with an astrophysicist joining us, Andrew Pike. Join us after the break. Welcome back to Now That's Weird. Now in part 3, joining me on stage is Andrew Pike. Andrew is an astrophysicist. Andrew, welcome to the programme.
Thank you.
Now, you got involved in UFOs basically from watching a telescope and looking at the skies, I believe. Is that right?
Well, yes. I mean, the first sighting that I had was actually way back in 1976 from London, from my back garden. That was a glorious sunny summer, and it was plenty of opportunity to look at the sun on this particular occasion. So I'd had my telescope set up looking at the sun, and that's where I first saw my first UFO. From there, I mean, as an astronomer, I was sceptical. I didn't think these things existed, but I'd seen something I didn't understand. So for many years, not a great deal happened until we rolled up to 1980, and Rendlesham happened. Just before Rendlesham, I had been asked to go and look into something involving the Berwyn Mountain incident, which was 1974, but I went back there in the summer of 1980 to have a look at some new evidence that had come up involving really meteorites and earthquakes which were associated with that particular case. From there, I found myself in the December, or just after December, in January, the December incident of Rendlesham Forest, which happened over the Christmas week of December 1980. Now again, I found myself down in Rendlesham because we'd been told that something had fallen into the forest, something had fallen into the North Sea. There had been a spectacular meteor display on Christmas night, which I had seen. So we went down there to have a look at meteorites again, and found ourselves wrapped up in Rendlesham Forest UFO mystery. From there it just snowballed, and before I knew it, I was into UFOs.
Now, Rendlesham, obviously, guys, is one of the great cases, isn't it? It's probably second behind Roswell as an incident. Alan, let's just come to you for a second. What's your view on what happened at Rendlesham Forest?
Well, once again, you know, from the military testimony, Larry Warren as an example, clearly something happened there. And, you know, what wasn't known, of course, by the general populace is that it was a base holding nuclear weapons. So, you know, they would have been very concerned about an object that was clearly not the lighthouse that had come down into the forest. Interestingly, I went there recently and took some photographs of the various areas, including the supposed landing site. And on the picture came back one of those incredible orbs, a large orb on the photograph. You know, and there's been a lot of anomalous activity since that sighting that people are seeing there. So it is a very strange place.
Well, I think since Ray's sighting and the story breaking last year, again, Rendlesham has come back into the news, and we're going to be hearing from Larry Warren in just a moment, who was there on the night. But Andrew, let's come back to you. More recently, you've seen things locally here near Glastonbury. Tell us about some of the other sightings.
Yes, well, specifically the Glastonbury area is quite famous for the flying triangle. And in particular, one sighting I was very heavily involved in, it was in Buckley, not far from Glastonbury, where a large black triangular craft was seen to very slowly hover over the car as the occupants of the car were driving down between two fields. There was some telegraph poles across one of the fields, so it was not very high. This craft came, just missed the telegraph poles and banked over towards some farmhouses which were at the end of the road. Now this is a very narrow, you can only get one car down, you can't pass unless you pull in. So this is a very isolated area, and very fortunate that this happened at just the time. So I don't think people were meant to see this, because it was a very, very quiet area. But this craft, just amazingly, just slowly, I mean, almost so slow you would think it would fall out of the sky, and just banked over the telegraph poles, over towards the farmhouse, and disappeared.
Amazing. Now, as an astrophysicist, you're obviously, like everybody else on this stage, someone with a logical and rational viewpoint. At what point did you suddenly decide these are not of this world, these are something I can't explain rationally and logically by definition?
Well, probably not for many years. As I say, I got interested mainly through the Rendlesham Forest incident, which was 1980, and that I researched right the way through pretty much to today. I still have an open file on that on my desk. But I would say that probably as I was investigating Rendlesham, I was looking into the strange electromagnetic effects that the airmen were reporting. Now, these airmen were not scientifically trained, so there's no way they could fake this. They were just saying what they saw. They were trained observers, and from that, and this is where the science becomes interesting, because this is far more than just a light in the sky.
Absolutely.
This really does, you know, give you a lot of information. There's a lot of science, and sightings where you get this sort of information are the ones that are really the ones that the scientists are interested in.
Absolutely. Well, let's have a look at this in greater depth now. Larry Warren was US Air Force security at RAF Bentwaters on the night of the Rendlesham landing, which he tells us took place over 3 nights, not 2, as documented in so many of the stories. Let's hear what Larry has to say about this. He was at the Now That's Weird conference last weekend.
My name is Larry Warren. I was 81st Security Police, RAF Bentwaters in Woodbridge in Suffolk, East Anglia, December 1980. I was a witness to the 3rd night of UFO activity in Rendlesham Forest. I saw an object on the ground and a life form associated with it. This was witnessed and filmed by numerous individuals. The documentation is overwhelming and would win in any court of law should such issues be decided in a court of law. And though it is the bastard subject of the 21st century, myself and many others are now starting to speak of this incident. I have for 27 years now, and it needs to be dealt with in a good way, in a positive way, because once the cat's out of the bag with the Rendlesham Forest incident, all the other cover-ups on the UFO phenomenon that's gone on for 60 years now will fall like a house of cards. And that has been my only intention for all these years, to take care of business in that way. A lot of people suffered from these events, medically and otherwise, psychologically. The United States government and its arms of the intelligence community manipulated the aftermath caused what I believe was a self-inflicted death by one of the individuals for handling his own dealing with the case wrong. I hold our base command responsible. Even though they're on pensions, I hope their consciences still work, and that's why I'm in it.
Well, there, Larry Warren telling what actually happened from his viewpoint. And I have to tell you that Larry told me at the conference, when he was talking about becoming a whistleblower, he spoke to one of his seniors and said, what would happen if I told the truth about this incident? And apparently they said to him, bullets are cheap, Larry. Now, Ray, you know a little about this yourself. Tell us your view of, about the Rendlesham incident.
Well, I had the pleasure to meet Colonel Holt and Jim Penniston. In fact, I had a look at the diary that Jim Penniston made as he was photographing the hieroglyph type figures on the side of this craft. He actually made a note of them in his diary, which was one of the things that weren't confiscated. So he's still got that, and I've had a look at that personally. They're both credible characters. I don't think they'd be wanting to pull the wool over anybody's eyes, and for the I think for the danger that they put themselves into, or possible danger, they've come clean for a good reason, and I think they want to try and expand their knowledge base, really.
Absolutely. Well, another thing about Rendlesham that Larry told me at the conference was that there was film made of ET contact from the craft with the base commander. Now, that film apparently was then flown to Germany by military aircraft and on to the Pentagon. So somewhere there is evidence of actually what went on. Andrew, what do you make of that?
Well, it certainly would be the evidence that scientists would love to see. I mean, with any of these UFO cases, we want something a bit more substantial than just a light in the sky. And there are many, many examples of that. What we're really looking for is something which is coming from good witnesses, such as the military, astronomers, pilots. We're looking for some real scientific evidence. We're looking to see how the science may be working. And from there, we can hopefully get an angle on what this is all about.
Alan, Rendlesham, obviously your research as well. You spent a lot of time looking into this. What's your view on what happened that night?
I do believe what happened was an anomalous object, possibly off-world. There are some of the military personnel who do acknowledge having seen beings there, so it wasn't just literally a vehicle. There were actual creatures that they say were similar to, like the grey alien. Certainly that film footage was being filmed when they were appearing, so you know, again, possibly on this film you would have that as well. So there is evidence for it, something unusual.
Okay, well, one thing we're going to do each week on Now That's Weird is we're going to have a look at what they're talking about in the forums. And one of my favourites is abovetopsecret.com, which has a plethora of different subjects, from world mysteries and conspiracies through to UFOs and the paranormal. And many of you who listen to the radio show will have heard my wife Penny in the background doing all the production and all the hard work that goes into the show. Now you get to see the face as well. Penny's in the audience. Penny, what have they been talking about in the forums this week?
Well, while I was researching on ATS, and of course, once you go into a link on ATS, it then gives you other links, and you end up going in a whole maze of things. But the one thing that they're talking about at the moment is the Cardiff incident. But it was interesting that there was two further stories that were linked to that. One being another at a barracks in Shropshire, where a young squaddie had actually filmed 13 UFOs on his mobile phone. And he showed it to his superiors. Exactly what they said about that, I'm not 100% sure. But more interestingly, I did actually watch the footage of that, and there was a lot of little lights in the sky, all twinkling as best as they could on a mobile phone footage. But the interesting story is a further one of a couple who, in Cowbridge in South Wales, during the day before the actual Cardiff helicopter chase, set off about 1,000 lanterns that they'd purchased to mark their wedding, and set those off up into the atmosphere. And they set them off the day before, and in the early hours of the morning of the day of the Cardiff UFO helicopter chase. Now, again, the lanterns, and they showed you an example of one, looks extremely similar to the ones taken by the young squaddie who'd filmed it on his mobile phone. But certainly a lantern could not make a whole UFO chase and cause a helicopter to actually speed off with running out of fuel.
Okay, well, there you go, the abovetopsecret.com forum, well worth checking out, and each week Penny will be bringing you the latest that's going on in those forums, and I can tell you, a lot of stuff that goes on in there is well worth reading. There's some very, very good evidence in there, without a doubt. Now, lanterns, come on guys, could these police, 3 policemen in a helicopter have misidentified a lantern?
No, I think these lanterns are being used far too often to explain away UFO sightings.
It's a bit like a weather balloon at Roswell, really, isn't it? It just doesn't work, does it?
Many of the reports I've seen, it just doesn't fit, no.
Alan,
Yeah,
what's your thoughts?
I agree entirely. Yeah, it's a great way of saying there is an illuminated object in the sky, but you know these guys know what they're seeing. They're seeing solid objects, so it's not that.
Now, Ray, you're up there in the skies yourself as an airline pilot. Would you be able to make that sort of mistake between a UFO and a lantern?
I've flown past a few balloons from the ground, you know, the type that you put a message on and let go at the funfair. Yeah, seen loads of them. There's no mistake. You can't make that sort of mistake. Though I would mention the fact that the other famous police helicopter chase was over the Brighton area. About 6 or 7 years ago. There's film of that on the internet, and I think the only reason that came to light with the film, infrared and normal light and still pictures, is the fact that that helicopter pilot was retiring that week. So he didn't really care about any repercussions. Now, I think what's happened here is the possibility that there may have been a little bit of arm twisting going on. Perhaps the police force don't want to get involved with that sort of publicity. Not sure, but
I think you could be right.
That's likely.
Now, Alan, let's just come back to you just for a moment. Some of the more, I suppose, stranger UFO sighting reports that have come to you as an investigator. Let's talk about those for a moment, if we may.
Yeah, in one particular case I can think of is this is a lady who was airline personnel. She was cabin crew. She now works for the police force. And back in '98, she was travelling down the A11, and this is right near the very large US military bases of Mildenhall and Lakenheath. They stopped. This was at night. They stopped. And they saw these lights approaching them. They were in a parking bay. These lights approached them, and they had a clear view through above their car. This craft stopped literally above the car and then sort of positioned itself right above them. They were so frightened they drove off really fast, and they were doing about 90 miles an hour on the A11 when they were approaching a bridge, and this object was stuck sort of like glued to above them, only about 30 feet above. As they were approaching the bridge, they assumed that it was going to hit the bridge when they went under at speed, but actually they saw it like stretch, like morph to the left. They burst out the other side, and then this thing came again and repositioned itself directly above their car, travelling at 90 miles an hour as they continued on this journey, until eventually it pulled away, you know, several miles further on. They knew that it wasn't any ordinary craft. It wasn't so much the fact that it could actually glue itself above them, in effect. It was the way it seemed to stretch and elongate, you know, to go around this bridge. Very strange.
Amazing. Now, Ray, as an airline captain, again, this is something that must have changed your life, I would have thought, because to suddenly see something like this and to be the focus of media attention all over the world must have had an impact. How has it affected your life?
Not at all, really.
No?
No.
That surprises me.
Well, it's nice. It's nice to be involved in something like this. You know, people training and you know, people who are doing very well. But my 99% normal life carries on. I get a huge amount of mail every week, internet accesses, and no, not at all. Still as happy as ever, you know.
Well, thank you to all of my guests, to Captain Ray Bowyer, to Alan Foster and to Andrew Pike, to Penny for doing the forums, and to the audience here. It's brought us to the end of the very first Now That's Weird. Next week we're going to be talking about 2012. The forums are telling us the world's going to end. Nostradamus predicted something happening around that time. No matter where you go in the world, whether it's Mayan, Tibetan, everybody seems to be intrigued by 2012. Next week we'll try to get to the bottom of it. Join me again. My name's Ross, and I'll be bringing you more weird stuff.
Tonight's On the Edge with me, Theo Chalmers. Tonight's show is once again 2 hours long and live. So if you have any questions for our guests during the show, text them to 87778 with the word EDGE, a space, and then your name, location, and your message, and we'll try to pick up at any that really hit the mark. They're all charged at standard rate, so why not get texting? In tonight's show, I'll be talking with 2 guests on the subject of how the National Health Service is supposed to provide care free of charge at the point of need. However, if you are old, and especially if you have some savings, the NHS often opts out in some cases, apparently illegally. My 2 guests are campaigner Angela Sherman, who has been successfully fighting to claw back the tens of thousands of pounds extracted by the NHS from her aged parents for their continuing care, and lawyer Simon Stone. What a show we've got tonight. Welcome.
Good evening.
So, Angela, I'll start with you if I may. Tell me a bit of the history of your parents and how they came to be at the mercy of the NHS.
That's a good way of describing it. My parents are quite unusual in the sense that most of their adult life has been checkered by illness. They were both diagnosed with Parkinson's disease about 25 years ago. That's a really unusual thing for a husband and wife to both have Parkinson's and to be diagnosed so early in their mid-50s.
Right.
So obviously that's been something that's progressed over the years. My mother has had 3 strokes. She has dementia. She is a frail elderly lady. My father has terminal cancer and he also has dementia. So it's a really, really difficult situation.
I can see that it is, but if they had Parkinson's for 25 years, presumably have they been in care all this time? Or?
No, they've been in care for the last 4 years.
So they were able to stay at home and look after each other?
They were at home until 2005. When really things reached a crisis point. My father was looking after my mother, but my father was deteriorating a lot. And it reached the point where something had to happen, and I made the decision that they needed to go into nursing care. It was a really difficult decision.
You made the decision?
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't a clinical decision then?
Social services had been saying that they really should consider care, full-time care. As I would be, you know, they resisted that, but there came a point when they just could not look after themselves anymore.
And you weren't living there, presumably?
No.
Okay. How old were they then, can I ask?
Yes, well, they're now late 70s, so sort of...
Early 70s?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, no, probably 60s. My math is not very good here.
So when they went into care, they were sort of mid-70s.
Okay, yes. So, all right, so they went into care, and how did the money aspect of it develop?
Well, that's interesting, because I think, like most people, I just assumed if they had savings, they would have to pay for their care. I think a lot of people assume that. I don't know where that comes from. It's perhaps a conditioning that we have. I knew from the fact that they'd had to pay for some care at home themselves that, you know, social services realised they had some savings. And so when they went into a nursing home, immediately they were paying for themselves.
Did they both go into a nursing home together at the same time?
They did, yes.
Okay, and instantly they were paying,
Mm-hmm.
and they were doing that, what, from their savings or pensions?
Yeah, that was coming out of their savings. And yeah, their pension was adding towards that.
So they weren't having to sell their home or anything?
Not at that point, no. And at that point they were paying, each paying £500 a week.
Okay, so that was £1,000 a week. That's quite a lot of money, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and so how did your consciousness, if you like, develop from there that perhaps they shouldn't be paying for this? I mean, what does the law say? I mean, perhaps I should ask Simon this. Well, Simon, you're a lawyer. What does the law say?
Well, in essence, it's about the extent of the health need. If the health need is primary, then they should be covered by the NHS.
As opposed to?
The local authority.
No, sorry, I didn't mean that. If the health need is primary, as opposed to what?
Well, it depends how poorly they are. If they're very poorly, it's an NHS requirement.
And if they're not very poorly?
And if they're not very poorly, then it'll be covered by care offered through the local authority.
Okay.
And that is means tested.
Right, so if it's social need,
yes,
it's means tested.
Yes.
If it's medical need, it's free at the point of need.
That's right.
That's what the law says.
That's the essence of it. There's a 2006 National Health Act which says in Section 1 quite clearly that it's free unless determined otherwise. And there's always a possibility, as you could imagine, the cost of health care is huge.
Well, if it was £1,000, was that a month? Or
For both of them for a week.
For a week, £1,000 a week. That's a huge amount
It's
of money.
considerable. So there has to be an assessment, an understanding of the state and condition of the person. And if the primary need is a health need, then they will be covered by the NHS for free. If it's not, then the local authority take over, and it's means tested.
Okay, so presumably you learnt this, did you, Angela?
Yes, I knew before, because my parents had had some care at home, and they'd had to pay for it. I knew that instantly they were being means tested. And when you go into a care home, you're supposed to be assessed for nursing care, but that doesn't necessarily happen in the way it should. And
well, let's talk about your specific cases then, your parents. Did it happen?
My mother was assessed for nursing care 3 months after she went in. That's normal.
So whatever happens, you're going to be paying for the first 3 months?
Yes.
There's a kind of like a hidden tax, if you like.
Well, you could call it that, yeah.
Okay. So
and at the point that she was assessed, they decided that she wasn't eligible for any NHS nursing care.
so they were saying her need was social, not medical, even though she'd had Parkinson's for 25 years,
Yeah.
and she had dementia, and what else did she have?
She's had 3 strokes,
3
so
strokes.
she's a very unwell
Was
lady.
she paralysed from these strokes in any way? Or?
She was very much disabled by the strokes, and her cognitive function was affected a lot by it.
But she had no need whatever for medical care, despite these.
That's right.
And this is what the home decided.
The home doesn't decide it. The
Okay.
NHS goes in and assesses, and then shifts the burden onto social services,
Which is the local council.
which means that you're means tested, so you end up paying. So the assessments themselves are an interesting experience. When my mum was assessed, I didn't actually know anything about it, because when you go into a care home, if you're the adult child, you've never been through that process before. You don't know what to do. If your parents have any kind of savings, doors slam in your face. Social services will not help you. They will not give you any advice.
Were you not acting in the place of a guardian for your mother at this stage?
I am her power of attorney.
You are so surely they should have consulted with you and told you that they were going to have this assessment.
Should have done, yeah.
But they didn't.
Not at that point.
Okay.
It was up to me to kind of discover that this was happening, and then to make sure that I was in the loop.
All right, so you discovered after the event, and how did you discover after the event? Did you ask them if they'd been an assessment?
No, I started reading about funding, and I started reading a lot about, how people are supposed to be funded and how people are funded in practice or not. Also, I saw a television program about one of the legal precedents, a lady called Pamela Coughlin, who took the NHS all the way to the appeal court for this very thing. And I started to realise that actually we maybe shouldn't be paying for this care.
So I'm intrigued. I mean, surely the law says if there's a precedent, if this woman Coughlin had taken the NHS to court, surely after that the NHS should have said, OK, we'll pay.
Yeah, you'd think so, but the NHS doesn't always abide by precedents and test cases. And there are thousands of families in this situation, and there are thousands of people paying for care illegally because they should be funded by the NHS.
You're saying it's illegal?
It's illegal for the NHS to force you to pay for your nursing care if your primary need is a health care need.
And I would have thought it's fairly self-evident that if somebody's suffering from the things that your mother was suffering from, and we'll get on to your father, but just talk about your mother for the time being, that is a prima facie case, isn't it? There's a medical need.
The funding that I was looking for is called NHS Continuing Care, and that's supposed to be available on the basis of illness, disability or accident.
So 2 out of 3 was your mother, wasn't it?
You'd think so. Although when it comes to the actual assessments, the NHS will say it's not about being ill. You can be as ill as you like. It's about the actual nursing need. So you can be almost dead and you would still not qualify.
But surely if you are almost dead, and let's say that's not the case, but if you are almost dead, surely you need nursing care, don't you? I mean, that's a given.
I would agree with you there, yes. It doesn't work that way.
Okay,
the system is flawed.
So you did this reading. You discovered that perhaps your parents shouldn't be paying £1,000 a week. So what did you do next?
So I realised that my mother had had 2 assessments, both of which...
2 now?
She'd had 2, both of which had decided she was ineligible for any funding. The second assessment, they just added a few comments on, so it really wasn't done properly.
Who made the assessment?
The NHS.
So, but what sort of people? Were they doctors or?
No, it's usually a nurse assessor, plus
This is a professional role, is it? That nurses,
it is.
The nurses have, okay.
Plus somebody from social services, plus somebody from the care home. Any assessment like that is supposed to be a multidisciplinary team, but at no point were any of my mother's physicians, neurologist, GP, any of them were involved. Her full medical notes were not consulted. It was a really, really superficial decision.
How can they possibly make a judgment about the state of her health if they're not looking at her medical records?
Good question.
Surely this is, I would think, potentially incompetent, isn't it?
It's totally flawed. And it's the system that's flawed. The system allows for interpretation of the criteria. It doesn't actually force people to look at the whole picture. And if you're not there at the assessment as the relative, you have no chance. Things will just go by without you picking up on them.
So you learned that there'd been the first assessment, and what did you do? Say, I want another one?
There were two assessments before I kind of picked up on what was happening.
There were two before you were told, even, that they were... Why were there two? Why wasn't there just one?
There was an initial one, and she was ineligible for that, and then for some reason they assessed her again, and you know, it was like a... I guess she was on a schedule.
So they could say, oh, we've done a really thorough job here, we've done two assessments, and there's nothing wrong with her at all. She's just in here because she likes to have tea twice a day, or whatever it is they give them.
So I wrote to say, you know, I thought actually she should be eligible for some kind of nursing care. And I asked for copies of the assessments that had been done previously, together with the criteria they'd used to assess her. And I received copies of the assessment, but no criteria. So I was very suspicious that they hadn't actually been done properly. And then they agreed that they would do another assessment. It gets very repetitive, and they put that to an internal panel within the PCT.
Primary Care Trust.
That's right. And that came back again as no, ineligible.
Well, you were invited to this third assessment?
The third one, yes, I did go to.
You went to it, and did they have her medical records?
They didn't have her full records, so I was inputting with information about her health.
That shouldn't be up to you, though, should it? I mean, you're not a doctor, are you?
No, I mean, obviously, I probably knew her best out of anybody in that room. But you would think that they would pull together everything possible, or at least consult the people that have, you know, monitored her care over the years. But that didn't happen. And that's the same in a lot of cases.
OK, so you went to the third assessment. You were the person who said, you stood up for your mother, effectively, and said, she has dementia, she has had 3 strokes, she has Parkinson's disease.
And they look at all sorts of things. They look at mobility, they look at your skin, they look at...
Well, the elasticity of it.
Yeah, to see how fragile it is. They look at your nutrition, they look at all sorts of things, your behaviour, your psychological needs, a whole range of things.
But how can they do that if they don't consult a doctor?
There's a lot of gaps.
How can you assess somebody's psychological needs if there are no experts in that field involved?
It comes down to a view from whoever's in the room.
So somebody with a vested interest, presumably, this is the NHS I'm talking about, says, well, no, you don't need this. So, but you were there.
I was there.
Could you not sway the panel, if you like?
I input a lot of data for that assessment, and then the assessment goes away and it gets written up, and it comes back again with the result, which was no funding. So at that point, I asked for an independent tribunal. And
you're allowed to do that, are you?
Yeah, and that takes place at the Strategic Health Authority.
Not the Primary Care Trust?
No, it's a separate panel of people with a chair who is outside the NHS.
And does this happen in the nursing home where your mother is?
It happens at the Strategic Health Authority offices, whichever area you're in.
Does your mother go to this?
No, and that's another good point, because at no point in any of these assessments was my mother examined, looked at. So the whole thing is based on someone's notes here, someone's notes there, and someone's view.
But no proper notes, none of the doctor's notes?
No, none of the doctor's notes.
So the person isn't there that they're assessing. It's mind-boggling, isn't it? They don't refer to the experts' notes, and they just go, OK, so this was now the fourth hearing.
So the independent tribunal would
independent tribunal was your fourth hearing
thing, and that was, I think that was January '07, and I'd heard nothing, and it got to about April, and I wrote to the Healthcare Commission. The Healthcare Commission wrote back to say they can't actually help until after the independent tribunal. So it's a catch-22. What do you do?
So the independent tribunal could take as long as it liked.
So I wrote a long letter of complaint to the NHS, outlining all the reasons why I felt this was imperative and why the assessments hadn't been done properly. And I still heard nothing from the Strategic Health Authority. And at this point,
I was 4 months on.
Yes, it was actually about 6 or 7 months on.
Okay.
At this point, I was also realizing that I needed to do the same whole thing again for my father. So that was just an added complication.
Yeah, because he'd been assessed as well, presumably.
Yes, although we'll come on to that,
Okay,
because
we'll
it was a slightly different case.
All right, so here we are. You've got to the fourth assessment. They've declined to arrive at any conclusion for 6 months.
Well, yeah, then it went on to October.
You can't appeal. So this is now 10 months.
Yeah.
You can't appeal because without the judgment, if you like, you can't appeal it. So this is now 10 months. Presumably, were they hoping that perhaps your mother would suffer some sort of catastrophe?
I think, actually, at that time, there were so many people raising this issue that there was just this huge backlog. But that doesn't excuse the fact that there was just no communication.
Right.
But at that time, this was a real low point, because at that time, my mum ran out of money to pay for her care. There was no more money. And I wrote to social services and said, you have to help us. What do we do? How do we pay for care?
What would they have done? Thrown her on the street?
Well, I applied for temporary financial assistance, which is emergency funding.
Did they say you should pay?
The care home did at one point come after me for money.
They came after you?
Because they need to be paid. But it's a really difficult situation. So social services then started to fund her on a temporary basis, which we would then have to pay back. But at least, she could stay in the care home.
Because she still had a house?
Yeah, she did
still
have a house, which was, at the time, we couldn't sell it because it had subsidence, but that's a...
You had tried to sell it then?
Yeah, we had tried to sell it.
Okay, but at least they had that house.
So, still nothing from the Strategic Health Authority, so I wrote to the Healthcare Commission again, and they said that on account of the delay, maybe they should fast-track it to the Health Service Ombudsman. And very strangely, at that point, I received a date for the tribunal.
But they'd been in the tribunal already, hadn't they?
No, this was the one I was waiting for, the independent tribunal.
Sorry, hadn't it already happened?
No, so it was now a year on.
Oh, I'm sorry, I thought it had happened, and they just hadn't arrived at a judgment.
No, still waiting for the tribunal.
I beg your pardon. So a year on...
A year on, we finally got a date for that.
For the tribunal.
And Simon and myself, together, we put together a submission for that. The guidance that Simon was able to give me was excellent.
What was the guidance, Simon?
Well, there's been a lot of this going on, so there was a lot of information. At this point, when Angela was going through these difficulties, I was not versed in this area of law, so I had to learn it as I was going along. And it became very clear to me that there's a huge gap here where there is a tremendous need, but it's not fulfilled by the authorities that exist. So I had to go and find where the law was and put together an argument for. And it was then when we discovered these cases, which have now become landmark cases, and you mentioned one just now, the Pamela Coughlin case. And we put a submission based on the law, and in particular on Angela's mother's condition. You've got to bear in mind that this tribunal also doesn't see Angela's mother, so we had to depict what she looked like and show
photographs.
Well, no, we had to do it in words.
Like mime, like Marcel.
Just simply in words, talking about what she can do, that her state of health, her skin condition, to the fact that she's mainly confined to bed, her cognitive skills or otherwise, as the case may be. And by doing that, we were able to describe this very poorly woman to, in our view, hopefully make them understand that this is a case of primary health need. To take the example, this Pamela Coughlin suffered a terrible car accident in 1971. And as a result of that, she was wheelchair bound, very serious injury, and she couldn't care for herself. If you were to see her, you would see that she's a medical need. And yet it took, this case went all the way to the Court of Appeal. It won in the High Court. The NHS appealed it to the Court of Appeal. They lost. And as a result of that, we had this very good precedent that said, this world here is in disarray. It needs to be tidied up. The guidelines that are issued are all over the place. Some NHS authorities deal with it this way, some deal with it that way. There's no synergy between them.
Do you think that there's pressure on the primary care trust or the NHS generally to refuse these cases because of the cost?
Well,
is it all about money?
As a cynic, I'd say absolutely. Of course there is. I'm sure there's lots of people who do these assessments who go to work with the intention of doing a very good job in accordance with the law and the rules and regulations that apply. But I can't help but believe there is a need to protect the public purse so far as these people are concerned. So they would like, ideally, the NHS to pass it over to the local authorities, who'd like really very much to send it back to the NHS.
I've got a text here from Paul in Warrington. He says, it's advisable to get a lawyer to safeguard your home. Give it to a family member. If not, the state will take it from you to pay for care. Is that advisable?
I wish it was. It's not quite as simple as that. If you've deprived yourself of an asset with a view to helping yourself, if you're going to go into any form of care, then the asset can be recovered.
Well, the government can go after your house, even if you've given it to your daughter, for instance.
Absolutely. There are certain time limits.
There you go, Paul.
There are certain time limits involved with this. But it also depends on your intentions. So, regrettably, that's a very simple way forward, and it's almost a good barrackroom lawyer's point. But regrettably, the law's caught up with that and says no.
Okay, so you can't do that. So you advised Angela, and you put together this case for her. So on the day itself, tell me a little bit about this appeals panel or whatever it is.
It's made up of about 6 people. When we got there, I was a little bit unnerved because actually 2 of the people, I think it was 2, were actually from the NHS, which I thought was a little bit not really independent.
Oh, well, the people who were deciding.
A couple of the people were from the NHS. Which not from the same area.
It's like me deciding whether I should pay tax or not, isn't it?
It is, although they were from a different area. But it was still, it just didn't seem quite right. But we went into this room where there was a panel of people, and we were able to put forward our case and answer questions. And we were in there for, I guess, about an hour and a half.
I was expecting something which was rather awkward. Having regard to the difficulties Angela had already experienced in putting these submissions forward by letter. But they were very good at listening to what we had to say and hearing our argument.
All right, so they listened nicely. What happened next?
And then we went away. They did what they did, and they had to come up with a decision. And fortunately, they decided that my mum had been paying fees illegally, and she should have been funded. And they agreed to backdate all of the fees from about April '06.
Right. We're going to. Before we go any further, I should say that we can't give out any legal advice on this programme. If you need legal advice on this subject, you have to consult a solicitor. Having said that, I'm going to go straight to the text here. We've got one from Linda in Birmingham, who says, this is what I've been saying for years. I am a nurse. It's all about money. Oh, it's jumped up. The NHS has little to do with care now. Is that your experience?
I would agree. Yeah, there's very little care in health or social care. There are some good people in health and social care, but the whole system does not care.
Yeah, well, Margaret from Bedford says, I really admire Angela and Simon's enduring commitment. It will be a great source of encouragement for those in a similar situation, and, you know, we hope that we can be encouraging for people in a similar situation. So, you had a victory.
I did.
With your mother on the, what, 4th or 5th attempt.
Yep, and they agreed to refund most of her care fees.
Why not all?
They decided that before April '06 she actually didn't qualify, and at that point I just did not want to go back and fight that one.
But why did they say? What was the reason
They
they
said
gave?
that before then her needs were social needs. So they were needs that needed to be means tested.
She'd had Parkinson's disease for 25, I don't have to tell you this, you know of course, for 25 years. She'd had 3 strokes over a period before she went into the nursing home, yes? And she had dementia before she went into the nursing home, am I right?
And it was gradually getting worse.
It was gradually getting worse. So it was a lie, wasn't it, when they said that she didn't need to be nursed?
Yes, I felt she should have had all her fees repaid. You have to make a decision about where you put your energy. And at that point, I was also starting to fight for my dad.
Well, we'll get on to him, but let's talk about your mother a bit more, because I'm interested. I mean, how did you feel about this? How did you feel about the NHS?
I was absolutely elated to receive the letter. It was a very emotional moment. I remember sitting on the stairs reading it, crying my eyes out with relief, exhaustion, anger, rage. The rage that had actually kept me going, fighting, was a useful rage, but it was also a very damaging rage if you let it get out of hand. But I was so angry about the whole thing, and but I was absolutely delighted that the panel had agreed to refund. You know, I felt it was some justice for Mum, and you know, it was something, and it was a good victory.
Did they pay your legal costs?
No.
Did they pay any costs for your time? You must have given up time for your work.
The money that they repay is purely for the person who has had the care.
So they let you fight and fight and fight and spend a lot of money, a lot of time, a lot of stress, and then you win eventually through a combination of hard work and perhaps a little bit of luck. And but even then, it's like a kind of, you know, it's a rather grudging victory, isn't it?
The NHS says that in the event of something like this, they will return the person to their financial position before it happened. Well, that's total rubbish, because you cannot, you know, claw back investments that you've cashed in. You cannot, if you've sold your house, you can't unsell your house. You cannot, you know, put that person back to the same position. And if I were to claim my costs, I would have to litigate. And at that point, it just wasn't in my...
What are the implications of that? I mean, Simon, if you were to go to law in that sense and litigate, what are the implications?
The implications are horrid, because it takes, again, an enormous amount of time. It takes cash, unless you're going to find a lawyer who can do it on a no-win, no-fee basis. And there are some that would do it. You've also got to make sure you're filtering out the lawyers so you get to those who are very capable in this area. Of course, there are lots of firms of lawyers not necessarily able to pursue a case of this type. So you've got to find the right people at the right price, and then still, if you can't get a no-win, no-fee, you've got to find the money to do it.
But even if you've got a no-win, no-fee, and correct me if I'm wrong here, is it not the case that if you lose your case, all the costs of the NHS, who no doubt hire the most expensive barristers and lawyers, fall on your lap?
Yes.
And even if you're on a no-win, no-fee with your lawyer, with your firm of lawyers, you might have to sell your own house to pay for the fat cat lawyers, excuse me for saying that, Simon, of the NHS.
It's the cat bit that got me there, really. I think that most of these firms will run an insurance scheme which will help in those instances. And anybody who would embark upon litigation without a fallback is foolish.
Okay, but it is still a very hazardous, because when we spoke about this earlier, you did say to me that in order to pursue the law in this sense, you either have to be very poor or very rich.
Or very rich.
But if you're somewhere in the middle,
as most people are,
it's not a wise course of action.
It's very difficult. I mean, my job, I think, as a lawyer is to keep people out of court. In this case with Angela, because I'm not a litigation lawyer, I needed to have the support of a firm that would be there if we needed to go to that next step. And in fact, I was speaking with them recently, an excellent firm of lawyers in Cardiff, who are pioneering a way forward with these sorts of cases. They've got 700 cases currently that they're dealing with, and they've recovered 4.5 million already. It's a tremendous unit, and they're working very hard for people there. And they were there going to be backing us up if we needed to go that next step.
And okay, we're going to get to that, obviously, because we're going to get to your father. I'm just going to read another text here. This is a chap called Brian from Maesteg. I imagine that's probably somewhere in Wales.
Yes.
Can the NHS afford to fulfil their obligations on this matter? I mean, do you have an opinion? Do you know? Either of you?
Well, there are about 420,000 people in care homes.
In the UK?
In the UK.
Well, is this Wales? Is this England and Wales?
We're talking here mainly England, because the system in Wales is slightly different.
And in Scotland it's very different, isn't it?
Yes, yes.
So there are 420,000 where?
In the UK.
The whole of the UK?
At the moment, there are about 30,000 people receiving the kind of funding I fought for. That's a small percentage of all those people in care homes.
Yes.
If we assume that, I think it's about 60% of people in care homes have dementia. So if we look at that kind of figure, and if, suppose, all those people, that 60%, were to have funding in this way, that's a huge amount of money. And no, I doubt if the NHS can afford it, but there must be a more transparent way of doing this.
Or they have to tell the truth. They have to say, sorry, we're not going to look after you. Perhaps.
Perhaps. But elderly, in my view, elderly people have been utterly betrayed because they were sold a line that their taxes, all their lives, would pay for the NHS, which would be there for them. They've paid the most into it, and now they're just left separated as a separate part of society that doesn't need the care that everyone else gets.
I think if we were to look at this properly, the NHS system simply doesn't have enough money to do what it needs to do, or what we expect of the NHS to do.
Yeah.
We need to put far more into the system than that. But as you can imagine, we've got a political level. The NHS is good, it's there to care for us, it's there to promote health. And then we've got the grey suit brigade, which are there to say, well, how can we make sure we don't leak out too much money here? And then you've got the people at the bottom who are trying to make the assessments.
But there's also the care homes. I mean, Paul in Warrington's text again, he said, care in these homes is substandard, charges from £350 per week plus. My wife used to work in one, and so I dare say he knows. I mean, what was your experience of the care home that your parents were in?
You never know what a care home will be like till someone's there. The one that my parents are in is no worse, no better than others. It's probably...
You can't really say though, can you? I mean, they might be watching.
I mean, well, I could be. I mean, it's fine. The people there are nice. The people are good. It's the system that is the problem. You know, the staff are great. They're lovely people. It's the whole system, the whole way that we treat elderly people that's the problem.
Okay, so let's just a little round up here on your mother, and then we'll move on to your father. So your mother had a victory. They paid some of the money back. Have you received that money?
I received that money. It took another 3 or 4 months to get the money.
Did they pay interest on it?
They did pay interest on it.
Wow.
I also claimed for physiotherapy fees because physiotherapy for my mother is absolutely essential.
Sure, put a few fees. Massage.
Because her joints and her limbs are quite contracted.
Okay.
It took quite a long time. It took about another 6 or 7 months to actually get the physio fees back. But I got them.
Okay, so you've got the bit between your teeth now, Angela, haven't you? You've seen a glint of victory here. So let's talk about your father. What was his situation?
Well, he had actually been in the care home for 2 years before I kind of thought, actually, his needs are getting quite serious.
So he'd had Parkinson's.
He's had Parkinson's
for a long time.
Yeah.
Well, what other needs did he have?
He was developing Parkinson's dementia.
Is that a kind of dementia that's associated with?
Yeah, it's a different kind, but it's essentially dementia.
Okay, so did he know you and that sort of thing?
Yeah, he still knew me, but he needed more care than my mother because he had the more typical Parkinson's symptoms. He was very shaky, very unsteady, had a lot of very bad falls. He needed more care, more looking after. And because he needed more care, and the care home manager had told me he needed more care, I started to question, well, why isn't he being funded? You know, is he still paying for himself? And then I discovered that no assessments at all had been done on him.
Didn't you think to ask, when you were fighting for your mother, who I suppose had a more obvious clinical need than your father, to start with at least, when you were fighting for your, did it not occur to you that you should ask for an assessment for your father?
Actually, it didn't. Because my father was better than my mother in that sense, I kind of left that, and I knew I could come back to it if I wanted to. But the case for my mother took so much energy, so much time, I needed to focus on that at the time.
Okay.
And then I moved on to my dad.
And you, okay. So tell us about that then.
So when I realised that he hadn't actually been assessed at all, I wrote to the NHS and said, you know, what's happening, what's going on, why isn't he being assessed? Could you send me any information on assessments that he has had? And he hadn't had any.
Is this the strategy then of the NHS? Because the longer they delay an assessment, well, there can be no decision about them paying while he's unassessed.
Yes, that's
so
right.
it's a deliberate policy.
But I suspect if they had assessed him, they would have found him ineligible. You know, it would have been a formality.
Because that was their policy, or because he was ineligible?
Because very few people win funding. And, you know, his needs at the time were very much like a lot of other people in care homes. And they're deemed as social needs.
So, I mean, it seems to me that, I mean, let's talk about your mother again for a second, that if you hadn't fought as hard as you did fight for your mother, she would still be
She'd still be paying, absolutely, yeah.
So if elderly people are in homes and they don't have a son or a daughter fighting for them, there's no one else that's
They
going to
have
volunteer.
no chance.
They don't have,
No
it's not, the care home doesn't appoint a sort of a champion for them or something, does it?
Care homes are supposed to flag up when somebody needs nursing care, and they're supposed to flag up when their condition changes. But very often that doesn't happen, and it's either because the care home just doesn't have time, or because the care home might be concerned that it won't get paid one way or the other.
Does it has to what, have a good relationship with the NHS, or?
Yeah, there is that need to have that relationship. Or it could be that the care home is simply not, the staff are not aware that they need to flag it up.
Or poor training.
Yeah, poor training, or just not aware that there is a link there. So if you're in a care home and you have no family, you're lost, really.
That's incredibly sad, isn't it?
Very sad, very sad. If you have no one to fight for you, no one else is going to do it, you know.
And obviously, if you have dementia, you simply can't do it for yourself.
And you wouldn't be aware of what
So
was
they
happening.
take your money, and they run.
In a way, in a way.
Okay. So, your father?
Yes, so I asked for an assessment to be done. At that same time, the government introduced a new procedure for assessments. There had been so many complaints that the Ombudsman had kind of directed that a new procedure should be in place.
Yes, it was as a result of that case, Cochrane, and another one called Grogan.
Grogan.
Yes, that was, again, a very important case. Maureen Grogan was a lady that suffered from multiple sclerosis.
Okay.
She had skin edema problems and a whole host of other issues.
Skin edema, what is that, a blood clot?
Well, it's where the skin can break out into ulcers.
Oh,
and she was a very poorly lady again, as with Pamela Cochrane. And yet again, it had to be fought through the NHS systems, and this one went up to the High Court. And again, the High Court said, yes, this is right. And it said to the Health Authority, this is wrong. You know, your interpretation of the guidelines here is wrong. But to be fair, the guidelines were all over the place. There needed to be some form of pulling together. And as a result, this national framework came into being. The Ombudsman had criticised it, judges had criticised it previously, and there was need for this national framework. So this national framework now says this is how we go about assessing people's needs. There's an initial assessment to establish whether there ought to be a further assessment. It's a sort of a weeding out process. And if a further assessment is necessary, then a nurse, a doctor or other healthcare employee who's qualified and able to do this is meant to take this forward with this medical specialist needs. At least 2 of them have to do this.
So the High Court's wrapped the knuckles of the NHS, but it hasn't had any effect, has it?
Well, it has had some effect. It's tidied up a lot of what was going on, I'm sure. But there is still the issue of interpretation of what these guidelines should be, and then a person's understanding of assessing this person against these needs. Where do I draw the line? And I believe that's where we have the fundamental problems, either because these people aren't trained well enough, they're too busy and therefore are making quick judgments, or there's a pressure on them to say, make sure you're going to go down the right side of the fence here.
I mean, I've got one NHS insider here who's texted before, Linda in Birmingham, and she says the whole system is the problem. This is why they were privatised and people could make money out of elderly people. The NHS will do anything to get out of paying, and well done for winning. So it's a bit kind of like granny farming, isn't it? These people open these centres and they have to find the I suppose the low-hanging fruit with regard to being paid. If they can get the money off the patients.
If they get money for fees from somebody who's paying for themselves, they get more money.
Oh, they get more money? So they have to give a discount to the NHS. Well, no wonder the assessments all go in favour of the NHS, because...
So if,
is that actually the case? You know that as a fact?
If somebody's been funded by social services, I know this from when I had the emergency funding, social services paid the home less than we were paying.
Well, they get a sort of bulk buy discount, do they?
Yeah, I mean, they block booked the rooms, the beds. But I did notice that when we had then had to pay everything back and start paying again, after we'd been able to sell the house, the fees were higher than the ones social services.
But the money you paid back was the block booking rate, wasn't it?
Yes, I paid that back at the block booking rate.
Yes.
But then our subsequent fees that we were still paying for Dad were at the higher rate.
OK, well, we're getting ahead of ourselves again here, aren't we? So let's quickly talk about your father then. So you wrote to the NHS and you said he hasn't been assessed.
So they did an assessment, and as Simon was saying, it was the initial filtering out or filtering in.
Were you at this assessment?
I was at the assessment.
And were you able to bring up his medical records?
Yep, the same thing, same process as before. They hadn't considered all the things that were important. They hadn't spoken to his neurologist, they hadn't spoken to a GP, they hadn't spoken to the psychiatrist that he'd been seeing. All these physicians that you would think would be important had not been consulted and had not inputted into the assessment.
Okay. Excuse me for asking, why was he seeing a psychiatrist?
He was seeing a psychiatrist because his mental health was deteriorating.
Oh, and he was making an assessment of that, was he? The psychiatrist?
Yeah. So all these things need to come into the pot, but they weren't. They weren't. So the filtering process took place, and then the NHS decided, rightly, in my view, he needed another proper assessment. It's a very long process. That then went to an internal PCT panel at the local primary care trust, and that came back to say no, not eligible.
Okay, so do they have to give you grounds for ineligibility?
They say that his needs are social needs.
So let me just recap again, because I'm finding it hard to get my head around this, really. So this is a man who's had Parkinson's for over 25 years at this stage. He's suffering from dementia, and he's only in the home for social reasons. What? Because he likes playing chess, or?
They call washing, dressing, and all the kind of personal needs, they call that social care. The fact that the reason he needs that is because he's ill is irrelevant.
Because presumably if he could, he would have dressed himself. I mean, I can't imagine most people, apart from maybe a 15th century monarch, would want to be dressed by somebody else.
I think one of the sort of cultural issues within the NHS is the difference between acute and chronic illness. And if you're acutely ill, you'd go to A&E, you'd be in intensive care, you'd have instant sort of medical input. If you're chronically ill,
that's ongoing illness.
Ongoing, you know, deterioration. The NHS just isn't interested.
But surely, if it's ill, it's ill.
Well, yes.
Illness.
But it's this cultural issue that I think is one of the problems. And because he's an old man, he's deteriorating gradually. He's got a degenerative disease. You know, it's a chronic condition. There's no real urgent nursing input in any given day. I think that's part of the system that decides that he's ineligible.
Okay, so after this initial assessment that you were at, they said we need a proper, what do they call this, proper assessment?
Another assessment. And that came back as ineligible, so I challenged it. And I think the NHS must have got totally fed up with me, because my challenges were always pages long, picking apart...
Well, you are a writer, aren't you? A professional writer. I think it's worth mentioning that. So presumably you wrote a great epistle about why they were wrong and they should fund your father.
Yes, and you have to pay attention to all the detail. You need to pick apart the reports and the assessments, because there will be errors throughout them. There will be untruths, there will be errors.
When you say untruths, what do you really mean?
I would say some of the language that is used in the reports, in the assessments, is designed to produce a result that requires no funding. For example, if I think of my mother's case, she's a woman who is completely immobile, dependent. I mean, you could call her paralyzed, really. She's totally immobile. And,
because of the 3 strokes?
Yeah, and the Parkinson's and everything else. And elderly, you know, she's very old, older than her years. And, you know, an assessment would come back and it would say, she uses a wheelchair for distance. And you would think...
Oh, that means she's running around the house the rest of the time. But actually, she was using it all the time, was she?
No, she only was in a wheelchair when somebody might be wheeling her to the loo. So it's that kind of thing. It's the kind of...
Because she was incapable of moving otherwise.
Yeah.
So the way, oh, I see. So what you're saying is that they worded it like that because
it kind of gave the impression she was able to just wheel herself around. And other things like, for example, one of the assessors came to do one of the early assessments, and Mom was in bed, but she was awake, and the assessor said hello to her, and she kind of murmured a reply. In the assessment, it said, oh, we didn't want to disturb her because she was asleep, and that was their reason for not including her in the assessment. It's little things like that you have to be so careful of, because the assessments will be littered with them. And unless you pick them apart, they'll just go through.
Can I just interject? What they're looking for here is the hook to say the nursing care or the medical care that is needed is simply ancillary to the other care, the social care that she needs. It's not the primary need. So they're trying to find ways and reasons to say, no, she does need a bit of support, she does need a bit of help, but it's not the primary issue.
Well, I've got something here. Malcolm in Lincoln has texted in. He said the NHS should spend its resources on those who can get better. What do you think about that?
It's a point of view. I wonder if somebody very close to him would also, he'd feel the same about that.
Well, let us know, Malcolm.
I wonder if he's in that position, if he would feel the same.
Yeah.
Just because somebody's not going to get better doesn't mean they're of lesser significance.
That's an interesting point, though, because we tend to treat the elderly very differently, don't we?
I think that's the
children.
case, yes.
We love the children, we care for them, there's lots of ahs about children. But when it comes to the old people, it's not quite that. It's the old person who's wrinkly and smelly in the corner. Whereas these people are children of somebody, are long gone, but they were loved, they were cared for. Now they're loved and cared for by siblings or by family. And yet somehow we depict them, or we treat them in our minds as something else. We don't give them the same credence, I don't think. And as a result of that, I think they are poorly dealt with within the system.
Yes.
And somebody needs to champion it. In this case, of course, Angela was championing it because it's her parents.
And of course, you must have been deeply hurt by what was happening.
Yes, terrible. It was a really painful experience. And, you know, they're my parents. I love them. I would, if I didn't fight for them, I would regret it always.
You'd walk over hot coals for them.
I would.
Fair enough. Okay, right, we're going to go for another break now. Once again, if you'd like to text in your questions or comments for Angela or Simon, please do so now.